Athel Loren is amongst the many wondrous expressions of life the Old Ones created to combat the forces of chaos. Why they felt a sentient magical force that transcends time and space, whose roots span across the entire world, was needed, is beyond our knowledge. One cogent theory suggests it was to compete with the power of the realms of chaos. The timeless, ever-shifting nature of Athel Loren itself is very reminiscent of how things work in the Chaos realms. Furthermore, wherever the winds of magic blow heavily upon the planet of malice, Chaos demons are able to jump from their plane to this one. This is similar to the world routes allowing instant transport across the world, wherever its roots remained unsevered and forests still grow. Through these roots, the forest spirits of Athel Loren discovered the woods of Avalorn within the elven home island of Ulthuan, far across the sea. For their part, the elves quickly grew enamored with the mischievous and eldritch nature of the spirits, and tried their best to coax what secrets they could from the ancient entities. This interest was mutual for the spirits, who sought to awaken Avalorn into sentience the same way Athel Loren had been. The most prominent of those spirits who came to love the elves in turn was the Treeman Ancient, Elder Durthu. He taught the elves to sing wood and brush into shapes providing shelter and tools without harming the bodies of the flora. Spirit and elf would now join together to transform Avalorn into a verdant utopia, shortly before chaos would bare its ugly, multifaceted head. The warp gates from which the Old Ones had entered this world shattered. From pole to pole and sea to sea, demons and madness descended upon the primeval lands of this world. The first Phoenix King of the Elves, Anarion, fought valiantly against the unholy onslaught, but he had left his children, Yvraine and Marillion, and his wife, Astariel, the Everqueen, vulnerable within Avalorn's forests, while he battled in distant campaigns. While the spirits and the elves of Avalorn fought more effectively as a combined force than they would have separately, the time came when Astariel and her children came under direct threat from Inkari, the favored greater demon of Slaanesh, god-goddess of pleasure and pain. To save the lives and souls of her children, Astariel made a pact with Durthu. The Elder would spirit away the Everqueen's children via the world roots. In exchange, the souls of many of her descendants would one day become eternally bound to the forest across the seas known as Athel Loren. What was once an indulgence of curiosity had now become the price for salvation. Ancient voices dissented. Who were these impetuous, short-lived, upstart creatures to presume they could stand eye to eye with the forest itself? What did they know of the Oak of Ages, of the Weave? What did they know of the voices of the trees, or the passing of the seasons? But Durthu had seen in battle that the elves were the allies the spirits needed in order for them to survive the darkness of the millennia to come. The pact was made. Their destinies set, and Astariel remaining behind to battle the demons in noble sacrifice, Durthu returned to Athel Loren with Yvraine and Marillion, who had been magically put to sleep. Upon arrival, Durthu saw Athel Loren suffering the same fate Avalorn had. While the forest survived the demon invasion, it came at the cost of its continent-spanning borders reduced to a corner of land between the Grey Mountains and the southeastern heaths of what would later become the Royarchy of Bretonnia. And those forest spirits who had not been destroyed or driven completely mad had changed into bitter, hateful creatures in the long battles with the forces of chaos. Eventually, the magical machinations of one particular Ulthwani elf named Kalidor the Dragon Tamer, along with some anonymous help from the lizardmen further west across the seas, were able to banish the demons back into the Chaos Realms, and Durthu returned Astariel's children to Avalorn. Soon, Ulthwan became a world superpower. Its trade colonies spanned the globe, and no navy could contest their sea power. During this time, many elves were drawn to the settlements near Athel Loren, whether by vision, dreams, curiosity, or natural inclination. Durthu's price was being paid. Back in Ulthwan, a civil war began. The sundering started when the son of Anarian's second wife declared himself the Phoenix King against the wishes of the Council and against protocol. From then on, those who followed the usurper King Malekith were called Dark Elves, called the Druchi by their own. Those who sided with the officially recognized Phoenix King were the High Elves, or the Azure. This civil war would end the friendship the elves shared with the dwarves through Druchi deception and Azure arrogance, after a diplomatic incident we shall explore further in another tome. In any case, Phoenix King Belshazzar called all elven colonists to return to Ulthwan to help fight during the Sundering. The colonies around Athel Loren refused. They had grown to love the forest too deeply, and had even set up magic channeling waystones to maintain the integrity of its borders. After this refusal, dwarves from the Grey Mountains came upon Athel Loren seeking vengeance against the High Elves, unaware that these particular elven colonists had nothing to do with the grievances they harbored towards the High Elves of Ulthuan. There are also greenskins on the march to the west. The forest shifted its own paths, blocking the dwarves where they could, and where they couldn't, they guided the dwarven companies into elven settlements that retaliated against the aggressors, peppering them with arrows. But both forest and elf began to realize the dwarven numbers were too great. The spirits of the forest promised aid at a price. As is always the case, only death may pay for life. The cost was the blood sacrifice of the elven colonists' greatest warrior, Lord Orion, and their wisest mage, Lady Ariel. This couple had disappeared during the meeting, and so the elves reluctantly marched to war against the dwarves without their greatest leaders. But their forces were bolstered by the swarms of forest spirits. This combined force drove off the dwarven throngs, but the greenskins had yet to be dealt with. More worrying was that winter had just begun, and the spirits began to slow and stammer and freeze, making them less effective, if at all, as battle allies. Through overwhelming numbers, the greenskins pushed the elves back to what would one day be known as the King's Glade. Here, they prepared a grim final stand. Before the battle lines collided, a magnificent cry from a horn was heard. From the forest emerged the likeness of Kurnos, the elven hunter god, having incarnated into the body of Lord Orion, whom the elves had thought disappeared. The horn sounded again, ethereal hunting hounds snapping at his heels. The demigod plunged into the rank of the surprised greenskins, scattering and goring dozens with each thrust of his divine spear. The sight of their god performing such glorious deeds reinvigorated the elves, and they followed this powerful being into combat with savage fervor. By the day's end, every single orc and goblin within Athel Loren had been slaughtered to a greenskin. The tired elves returned to the King's Glade, where they coronated Lord Orion and Ariel, the latter who had already been waiting near the Oak of Ages, having herself been transformed into an incarnation of the elven goddess of life, Isha. As a spirit utterly in sync with the seasons, Orion threw himself onto a burning pyre when winter finally arrived in full force, and the snows started to fall. The elves were confused and saddened at first, but when that following spring they heard his horde and saw his splendid form emerge from the forest line once more, they fully understood the nature of their new consort king. This was the founding of the ASRAI, now and forever, forest spirit and elf, ruled by consort king Orion and mage queen Ariel. As the centuries passed, Ariel began to sense an unnatural abhorrence through the weave. After some time searching, she and her informants found the source of this corruption. It was a foul entity, worshipped and followed by the beastmen, Morgur the Shadowcave, named Sianathar, or the Corruptor by Ariel. Where this vile creature walked, plants would twist into wretched shapes in blighted mockery of the natural weave. Crops wept black blood, trees bore rotten fruit, and the sanity of those nearby ebbed away into dark madness. Ariel immediately incinerated this creature and his followers where they stood with barely a deeper thought before returning home. But the Mage Queen did not realize the extent of Morgur's regenerative capabilities. She also underestimated the Corruptor's desire for her own power. More time passed. The early barbarian tribes of mankind began to migrate from the east over the Grey Mountains. They often clashed with the bands of greenskins who resided near the mountains, while the elves were amused to watch man slaughter orc and vice versa. When they approached the forest too closely, the elves would sally out from the trees to annihilate both sides. This was the beginning of the wild hunt. Every spring, Orion would lead the most restless and bloodthirsty of the elves and forest spirits on a vigorous trek to slay all sentient creatures in their path who were not ASRAI. This helped to thin the potential enemies around the wild heaths of Athel Loren's borders, and also released much of the pent-up violent energy the Wood Elves would feel after long, stagnant winters. Elsewhere, further along in time, the Shadowcave reformed his body and attacked Athel Loren at the head of a great beastman horde. He intended to consume Ariel, taking her power for his own. The elves were caught unaware. Many had thought the increasing numbers of beastmen in Athel Loren was just the result of its timeless nature. They believed the same horde was being slaughtered again and again, trapped in time and doomed to repeatedly attack and be defeated. The appearance of Morgur gave them cause to treat the attack more seriously, and eventually, the combined arms of elves and spirit vanquished the beastman horde. During the battle, Ariel had smote Morgur with the full magical might of the entire forest, and an area that now lays forever corrupted. thus known as the Glade of Woe. All life touched by his spilt blood has never recovered, and furthermore, this perpetual taint attracts unending tribes of marauding beastmen. So began the eternal shadow war between the ASRAI and the children of the ruinous powers beneath the canopies of Athel Loren. Among the ancient treemen elders who helped defeat Morgur was Coadil. He had despised the presence of the elves from the start, and now that many spirits were driven to greater bitterness and hateful thoughts by the taint from Morgur's fallen corpse, Coadil and some number of forest spirits who shared his dark rage decided to attack their former Wood Elf allies. They even tried to prevent Orion from reawakening from the Oak of Ages, but were quickly noticed and thwarted by Ariel following the first drop of elven blood shed, which disturbed the weave. She imprisoned Coadil and his forest spirit followers within a region of Athel Loren, now known as the Wildwood, to contemplate the error of his deeds until the end of time. Years became decades, decades became centuries, and in the following millennia, Athel Loren grew in size and splendor. There was peace for a time. Then Sianathair revealed his vile visage once again. Instead of attacking the forest, this time he and his unwashed hordes of slobbering beastmen aimed for a mountain known as the Silver Pinnacle, from which a great river flowed. While Ariel was grateful Morgur had switched targets from Athel Loren, she soon realized that the river the corruptor was headed towards could not be left to its fate. The world roots of the Oak of Ages spread far and wide, and defiling a water source this close by would be a catastrophe for Athel Loren. To stop this, Orion let out a wild hunt, murdering any human tribes caught in their path. Orion sensed a strange presence upon approaching Silver Pinnacle. After rending Morgur limb from corrupted limb with his own bare hands, and then throwing the gory mess into a flaming pyre, Orion led his wild hunt home to inform Ariel of the strange presence that he had felt. Both king and queen recognized the entity to be of similar divine essence to themselves, and thus decided to protect it again when Morgur reformed his body for the umpteenth time and again attacked the Silver Pinnacle. Upon arrival, the elves were utterly surprised to find that the human tribes that they had once hunted for sadistic sport had now united behind a champion who seemed to glow with the same eldritch energy that Orion had first sensed when he approached Silver Pinnacle. The Wood Elves ended up fighting alongside the tribes, who would later form the Kingdom of Bretonnia, and together they once again destroyed Morgur and his hordes. The tribes were exceedingly grateful to the ASRAI, who begrudgingly recognized them as having been helpful allies. Later, this alliance became official after Ariel discovered the source of the human champion's power. The Bretonnia tribe started worshipping the spirit of the Silver Pinnacle, naming her the Lady of the Lake. Ariel decided to help these tribes, now formed into the Kingdom of Bretonnia. She saw this new diplomatic relationship as a means of protecting Athel Loren, for the larger, more populous nation essentially functioned as a buffer state for the homeland of the ASRAI. Meanwhile, across the sea, the civil wars between the ASRAI's cousins, the Azure and the Druchi, raged on. Macleod, now called the Witch King, used to have a wife named Alisara. This elf happened to be Ariel's sister, Alisara, who had lived in Loren for a millennium, now grieved for the blackened heart of her former husband. She decided to travel to Nagaroth, intending to ease Malekith's hatred. The Witch King's mother, Morathi, was displeased to learn of this venture. Using dark sorcery, she manipulated and charmed a disgraced High Elven noble into believing Alisara and her retainers were reinforcements for the Dark Elves. This hapless fool attacked Ariel's sister and company while they passed through Bretonia. Upon hearing her sister had been murdered, the rage Ariel felt spread throughout the entirety of Athel Loren. Resentful silence within the wood was tangible, and Ariel swore vengeance towards those responsible. Morathi's enchantments had been reinforced by the dark winds of Dar, a type of magic Ariel was completely unfamiliar with. She found it difficult to discern who was originally responsible for her sister's death. She dove deep into the lore of forbidden spells to find answers, eventually learning to harness the power of dark magic herself. The Mage Queen used this newly discovered power to restore a few key world roots. The first gave access to the kingdom of Valyrian on the high elven home island of Ulthuan. Here, Ariel, Orion, and the great ASRAI Warwield following the two brought terror and bloodshed upon the confused subjects of the noble that Morathi had deceived. The Azure here put up a pitiful resistance, as this kingdom primarily worshipped Kurnos, of whom Orion was an avatar. Defying what was clearly an aspect of the hunter god would be blasphemy. The consort king soon wished to end the fight, which had become a slaughter without the challenge he felt his wild hunts should face. It was at this point that Ariel shattered the enchantments concealing Morathi's ill deeds. The Warwields once again traveled the world routes, this time to Nagaroth, a bleak, piney, cold realm the Dark Elves called home. They immediately began to assault the nearby fortress of Grond, Morathi's stronghold. Although she pleaded with Malekith for help, he slyly forbade any reinforcements to help her, as repayment for the murder of his wife Alisara, even as the Witch King feigned forgiveness in public, for he knew that Morathi was responsible. With fists the size and hardness of boulders, scores of treemen tore down the walls of Morathi's inner citadel. The Hag Queen, ever the deceiving opportunist, begged Orion and Ariel for forgiveness in exchange for greater knowledge of the Wind of Dar that she could sense Ariel had been using. Orion, for his part, was more than ready to tear her lying heart out, but Ariel, having already been partially corrupted by the dark magic she employed to find Morathi, agreed to this exchange. Knowledge for life. And yet, the true price would fall upon Ariel's own life and the lives of her subjects. For when Ariel and company returned home, a tangible sense of spite and bloodlust seeped through all the realms of Athel Loren. Sister fought against sister, spirit preyed upon elf. Needless expeditions of violence were fielded into foreign lands. All but the most ancient of spirits could not even perceive how terrible a place the forest had become. So deep had the darkness polluted the minds of the ASRAI, stemming from Ariel's use of the dark winds of magic. Even worse, Orion was unable to be reborn in the spring. In addition to these myriad woes, Morgur reared his ugly head once more. In response, Ariel marshaled a host to fight his horde. But when the time came to strike the killing blow upon the Shadow Cave, the Mage Queen, now utterly corrupted by the dark wind of Dar, revealed her true intentions. With the help of the best spellweavers in Athel Loren, she transported Morgor through the world routes to the King's Glade. Here she intended to enact certain rituals which would transfer Morgor's essence within her own body and soul, ideally eliminating the abomination for good and increasing her own power. Luckily, the ancient treeman Elder Durthu was well aware of her intentions and saw the folly in such a rash plan. He killed Morgor before the ritual's completion. This infuriated Ariel. Over the years, this fury translated into preventing Orion's rebirth for even longer, and sanctioning many senseless bouts of wanton destruction far afield from where the wild hunts usually traverse. The nearby dukedoms of Bretonnia, greenskin warbands in the mountains, innocent dwarven traders in their holds, Empire patrols lost in the forest. No matter the group or cause, all fell prey to the ASRAI's ill-done, excessive brutality. The elders of the forest could no longer abide. They and a company of elves and forest spirits who had retained their sanity traveled to the King's Glade to make Ariel see reason. The Mage Queen saw this confrontation as a usurper's defiance and called on her maddened kin to attack. The Untainted fought a losing battle against this onslaught, but in the end, one of the ancient Treeman elders, so-called Adonhu, managed to save all. Out of desperation, he reached to Ariel through the weave of life and death that bound all living things together and siphoned out the darkness poisoning her soul, drawing the corruption into himself. He died almost instantly, but he had done what he had meant to do. And then, not unlike a veil being lifted to reveal a comely face, not unlike sunlight finally shining through the canopy after a dark and terrible storm, Athel Loren was finally free from the stranglehold of Dar. Ariel retreated to the Oak of Ages to seek penitence, now utterly aware and mournful of her part in the corruption and desperate to redeem herself and all that she had lost. Ashamed of what she had done and committed to healing her soul and by extension Athel Loren, Ariel continued confining herself to the Oak of Ages for many, many years. She finally restarted the cycle of bringing Orion back to life every spring, but Ariel herself remained isolated. To help heal the weave, now severely damaged from the centuries of darkness, the council decided to right the wrongs the armies of the Wood Elves had committed during those ill-fated times. In the coming years, Dwarf and Bretonnian alike were often shocked to find their losing battles turn to victories, as unexpected volleys of arrows followed by the swift advance of elven warriors and forest spirits descended upon the greenskins and beastmen who threatened the land. These noble exploits did in fact strengthen the weave, and therefore hastened Athel Loren's recovery. Ariel, however, remained a penitent recluse. The shame of facing her subjects, whom she had damaged so greatly, was still too much to bear. To make up for her absence from the council, she appointed 2 emissaries in her stead. These twins embodied different parts of Ariel's essence, and thus the forest itself. Naistra was a black-haired elf imbued with the generous and bountiful aspects of nature, along with the prudent temperance of winter. Arahan was a white-haired elf with a bold and fierce temperament, representing the rapacity of forest life in summer. At first, the elves were wary of this mysterious pair, claiming to be Ariel's representatives, for none had seen them before, and the forest spirits are wont to disguise themselves via shape-shifting magic. The doubt was quashed following Orion's return from a wild hunt. He confirmed the twins were very much of his spouse's essence. The Wood Elves reassured, Naistra and Arahan became valuable members of the council, providing equal measures of bold action and cautious consideration between the two as needed. Somewhere nearby, Morgur had risen again, and Ariel knew she could no longer grieve the days away within the Oak of Ages. While some part of her soul would never recover from the winds of Dar she had exposed it to, she had healed enough to confront a threat as grave as the Corruptor. The citizens of Athel Loren were as simply pleased as punch to see their king and queen reunited as husband and wife should be, back at each other's sides. Between the dragon-riding twins of Twilight, Naistra and Arahan, Orion, consort king of the woods, Ariel, the mage queen, and a newly invigorated war-wield of elves and forest spirits, Morgur and his new war herd were swiftly crushed without much trouble, having achieved a glorious victory and now bolstered with the addition of the magical twins and the long-awaited reunification of Ariel and Orion. The ASRAI were the strongest they had been in centuries. Year 1. Naith the prophetess was a powerful seer and among the few ASRAI to resist the madness and corruption that had plagued Athel Loren for so long. This clarity of vision allowed her insight into particular omens that told of doom and destruction to come. These dire portents, along with Ariel's detection of a disturbance within the weave, became enough of a push for the prophetess and the mage queen to investigate further. Ariel determined that entities like herself, Orion, and the Lady of the Lake were vital to the stability of the weave, and something was constantly threatening the balance by targeting these entities. Ariel, Naith, and several hundred spellweavers decided to enter Athel Loren's shadow realm, the Dreamwood, called Athel Kalin, for greater insight regarding how to proceed. Their spiritual inquiry cost the lives of nearly half the spellweavers who entered the realm, their souls consumed by packs of rapacious, bloodthirsty demons dwelling within. Naith, Ariel, and the survivors discovered that many godly avatars such as herself that maintained the balance of the weave had already been totally obliterated, irreversibly corrupted, or entirely consumed. Ariel blamed these losses on the ASRAI's refusal to engage with the outside world, a characteristic she was partly responsible for cultivating. She pledged to play an even more active role in defeating evil in the outside world. In the year 19, the fallen and imprisoned ancient treeman Elder Coadil had a particularly spiteful handmaiden named Dryad, the so-called Briar Maven of Woe. She led a horde of spirits into the lands of Carcassonne, defeating the Lord and army who stood in their path, then sacking Lechild Abbey and claiming the sacred relics housed within as spoils of war. In the year 25, Wood Elves denied requests for alliance from Azure and Druchi diplomats. The High Elves, despite many millennia having passed since Athel Loren's founding, still refused to recognize the Wood Elf nation as a sovereign one, instead of a lost colony needing to be reined in. Regarding the other proposal, the ASRAI saw with swift clarity what the Dark Elves' assurances of shared glory actually were: a veneer of thin, meaningless words covering for obvious treachery. Year 77. Particularly strong winds of magic blew open the eldritch vaults of winter, unleashing demons upon the realm of Erenok. Lord of the realm, Amadri Dawnspear fought valiantly and died regardless. However, his soul managed to find a stout tree of deadwood, and he was reborn as treekin Amadri Arnbark. This form allowed him, with the help from a host of other forest spirits, to eradicate the demons from Erenok, forever sealing the vaults of winter with massive boulders that he moved with his newfound wooden strength. Year 167. A war host of Wood Elves led by Lord Araloth traveled through the world routes to Ulthuan, surprising and saving the High Elves of the Kingdom of Ivris from being overwhelmed by a Dark Elf raiding party. Year 195. Bretonnian errantry wars drove a greenskin Wa into Athel Loren, being inundated with hordes of beastmen already at the time. The Wood Elves tittered and chuckled with glee as the orcs and goblins did their work for them, slaughtering the children of chaos to a gore. When the green tide turned to the ASRAI for more battle, Durthu led his forces to easily crushing the remnants of the horde, and literally crushing the war boss with a well-placed stomping from his towering broad trunk legs. In the year 207, the ASRAI saved an ogre mercenary company traveling in Athel Loren from being overrun by another horde of greenskins. The captain, a fire-breathing brute named Gragtar Flameheart, was greatly saddened afterwards. Their Wood Elf saviors did not stay to share in the feast of charboiled greenskin flesh once the ASRAI Ogre Alliance was victorious. In the year 215, Scarlock led a small band of kindred spies posing as mercenaries through human lands to discover the goings-on of the world. Year 224. On a campaign to bring battle to the once again arisen Morgur and his beastmen herds, Naeth and Araloth were defeated after underestimating the cunning of the horde's Ungor scouts, who had shadowed the Lord and Prophetess, directing reinforcements that ultimately led to Morgur's escape in a disgraceful ASRAI retreat. Year 229. A contingent of ASRAI Wildwood Rangers saved the destitute Empire village of Lochinbod from a demonic incursion, while presumably pursuing a rogue forest spirit that had escaped from the Wildwood. When the last demon was slain, the Rangers disappeared back through the world routes, leaving the villagers dumbstruck. Tales began to spread like wildfire throughout the old world of the Wood Elves' noble deeds. Year 239. With the predictable reappearance of Morgur, Araloth, Lord of Taliesin, marshaled out a great ASRAI war wheel to avenge his past defeat. The Wood Elves hurried through the lands of Bretonnia towards the forests of Arden, concealed from peasants and knights by enchanted mists. When they arrived at their destination, they immediately noticed Morgur's corruption in the form of trees leaking black sap and grass growing as red as blood. The Fey host found the herdstone where Morgur and his new war herd set up camp, and the battle began. After a bloody struggle, Araloth used the essence of the Oak of Ages stored within an amulet gifted from Ariel, throwing the sap into Morgur's face. The following spontaneous combustion of white flames burnt the corruptor down to a black pile of ash. After slaughtering the remaining beastmen, Araloth used the remainder of the sap to burn away the corruption tainting the forest. Year 245. There came a time when the entirety of Athel Loren came under attack by the numberless hordes of beastmen. Among the many tragedies that befell the ASRAI was the famous Beastmaster Groarth, who died with his hand still strangling the throat of the wargore who had just slain his beloved saber-toothed tigers. Although the Fae folk managed to clear the majority of Athel, Loren of beastmen, many more were marshalling towards the Glade of Woe, the site where Morgr was first slain. The Wood Elves prepared a final desperate push before the battle began, and then the High Elves showed up, having been ordered to defend the forest by the Phoenix King to improve diplomatic relations. Eternal Guard fought alongside High Elf phalanxes, while Riders and Dragon Knights outflanked Centaur rushes as one. Azure Mages brought down lightning upon the foe, purchasing time for ASRAI spellsingers to rouse more forest spirits to action. The beastmen tried to retreat, but were easily massacred by the combined force of swift elves. Year 253. According to sources of suspect reliability, Morathi and some of her retainers were saved from an ambush of shadow warriors of the High Elves by a company of Dryads. The year 278. A vaguely pretentious winter turned Orion's rebirth the following spring into a maddened affair. The King of the Woods led a wild hunt 4 times the normal size that started slaughtering before it had even departed from Athel, Loren. The ravening host fell upon the dukedom of Quinay and slew the ruling lord along with many knights. During the sack of the nearby keep, Orion was calmed and turned back by mysterious feminine figures shrouded by mists. That following winter, Orion threw himself upon the ritual pyres months earlier than was his custom. Year 294. The forest of Avalorn in Ulthuan came under attack by Dark Elves. Malekith also released within the woods the favored greater demon of Slaanesh, Inkari, to create an opening for his forces to capture Alarauhio the Everqueen. When Ariel heard of this defilement of the forest that Athel Loren shared ancient ties with, she sent an army to intervene. The Wood Elves managed to stealthily redirect the greater demon towards the Druchii forces, buying enough time for Alarauhio to escape and for Teclis to banish the demon to the Chaos Realms. The ASRAI disappeared back through the world roots before the cause of salvation could be discovered. Year 333. Following the destruction of Awa, Orion slew the Orc war boss and impaled his corpse upon a stake near the borders of Athel Loren as a warning to other greenskins. Year 378. A dwarven throng from Karak Norn attempted to fulfill a grudge against Athel Loren, but the Wood Elves easily repelled the host. Year 425. Dryad, Briar Maven of Woe, and a host of Dryads stole an ancient artifact from a shrine to the imperial hunter god Tal. This was the second quick strike raid that Dryad had led, attacking out of nowhere, stealing something, and then disappearing just as fast as they had appeared. Year 488. A necromancer, Heinrich Kimmler, tried and failed after raising an army of the dead to conquer the Oak of Ages. The ASRAI, led by Durthu, forced his retreat. Year 491. An ogre mercenary band led by Captain Braggart Rockjaw was welcomed to Athel Loren with feasts and fairy wine. Later, while the drunken brutes were on their way out of the forest, they were herded by the ASRAI into a Skaven warren. The Ratmen stood no chance against ogres such as these, well-fed and even more violent in their intoxicated state. The foul creatures were completely slaughtered. The Wood Elves then left payment for a job the ogres had never agreed to. Upon achieving his sobriety once more, Captain Rockjaw swore to never step foot within these forests again. Year 496. A great friendship was forged between the Empire and the Wood Elves following a desperate battle with the Beastmen, where Naeth the Prophetess convinced Orion to save the Emperor Karl Franz from being overwhelmed and murdered by a horde of Minotaurs who assaulted his section of the battlefield. Later, an emissary from Athel Loren delivered a griffin egg to Karl Franz's court at Altdorf, sealing the alliance with a message that only said, "We will be watching." Year 499. The Wood Elves helped a dwarven throng led by Slayer King Ungrim Ironfist in a fight against Greenskins. But when the orcs were defeated, the dwarves turned on the Wood Elves for unsettled grudges, forcing the ASRAI to retreat. Year 500. The ASRAI besieged Karak Kadrin for revenge after what Ungrim Ironfist had done, betraying them, and only withdrew when the lord leading the assault felt sufficient blood had been spilled for repayment. Year 511. Dryad found the last artifact she had been searching for in the Bretonnian dukedom of Paravan, and was thus able to free her master Coadale from his prison in the Wildwood, before the Wood Elves were even able to respond. Year 514. The Bretonnian usurper called Malabad the Snake attempted to overthrow his father, King Loren Leoncoeur. He was thwarted by the Duke Armand of Aquitaine, his knights, and a contingent of Dryads led by Dryad, who had appeared from nowhere mysteriously, as she was wont to do. While they defeated Malabad, the Fey Enchantress, while she was helping to lead the Bretonnian forces, had disappeared along with Dryad and her Dryads once the battle ended, presumably kidnapped. Not long after, a Naiad spirit came to treat with Ariel and invited the Mage Queen to talk with the Lady of the Lake. That night, wild magic sparkled and exploded across the skies, and the following morning, Ariel claimed there had been a quote-unquote siblings dispute, which was now resolved. Year 515. The ASRAI paid little attention to the battles between Malabad the Snake and Loren Leoncoeur. That was before the usurper began to use necromancy to bolster his forces with undead soldiers. This affront to the weave needed purging, so Ariel sought out the Lady of the Lake to sort out their differences and solidify a final alliance. The lady agreed given the grave situation and used visions, dreams, and voices on the wind to call all knights across Bretonnia to Quinay to march alongside Leoncoeur and a Wood Elf wild hunt.